To Bissell, thanks. In the Vatican over the weekend, the leader of the Catholic Church, Pope Francis, has now ended a meeting about how to deal with the abuse of children by priests, claiming that there'll be an all-out battle against the abuse of minors. He also said that his church needs to protect children from, quote, ravenous wolves, end quote. The meeting had been described as a landmark gathering before it started, as the Catholic Church has been criticised for the way it's been dealing with the claims of abuse levelled against its clergy. But it seems that some victims of abuse and some groups who represent them are not happy with the decisions it's made. Lamprecht is a leader at the organisation Women and Men Against Child Abuse. He's here for you now. Luke, good evening.
Good evening, Stephen.
You're one of the groups who's not happy with the outcomes of the summit. Why?
So the main thing is that, first of all, the fact that the Pope didn't meet with the victims who actually arrived and left it to the bishops and cardinals was the first sort of indication that the seriousness of it wasn't the way we wanted it to be portrayed. The second element is the victims were saying we want an absolutely no sort of a zero tolerance approach to this, and it appears what the Pope has sort of painted like a worldwide context of abuse rather than honing in on his sphere of influence, which is his church, his cardinals and bishops.
So in other words, you're saying he criticised the fact that abuse happens. He didn't criticise people in his church for doing it.
Pretty much. They said that people in homes abuse, and most abuse happens in home. Most priests don't abuse. Even went so far as going back to say pagans in olden times used to do things as bad as kill children. So it felt a lot like deflecting rather than saying this is what we are going to do and are able to do in order to deal with abuse in our context, which is his sphere of influence.
Why is it important for him himself to meet victims of abuse? I don't know if they were invited to this gathering. I presume they weren't. So then if someone, you know, he has a particular meeting, it's his gathering, why was it important for them to be there and for him to meet them?
Well, I think that their versions to him and what they need should not be filtered through his clergy. So there should not be a filter. The great problem that the Catholic Church faces is the concept of papal infallibility. So if you look back to the Copernican revolution, where everything revolved around the earth, the sort of the impression we're getting now is that everything revolves around the church rather than the services revolving around the victim. Because essentially a church is a group of congregants rather than someone at the helm who is infallible and can't change his mind because he's a direct conduit from God. So it's a very tricky thing, and for him to be the direct conduit, the victims and his congregants should have direct access to him to explain how this abuse has affected them personally, not get caught up in some bureaucratic sort of canological kind of argument.
Okay, I mean, we could discuss theology, but let's put this another way. What action do you think the church should be taking, apart from the meeting? What do you think the church needs to do now?
Okay, so the first thing is that there needs to be a big debate around the confessional. So the confessional and the complete sanctity of the confessional is a problem because there's two elements, and the second element people often don't think of. The first element is that if abuse is confessed by a priest to a priest, there is this complete secrecy. The power behind abuse is the secret. What people don't often consider, and I've had a case like this in this country, is that if a priest abuses a child, that child is then seen by themselves, by the child themselves, as a tempter of the man of the cloth, and in that way kind of almost the instrument of the devil who has come to tempt men of the cloth. That child then goes to confessional thinking that they in some way have been complicit in the abuse, and that abuse is even not reported. Even further to that, we've had instances where people have told about abuse outside of the confessional and still told, if you speak out, you will leave, because this priest needs to be protected. That was in Mexico. That wasn't a local case, but that was a Mexican case that was reported quite widely.
Okay, I mean, that case aside, I mean, you're asking the church to basically put a bracket around certain crimes committed by some of its people and say, these are not covered by confessional.
Correct.
You're talking about 2,000 years of history. They're not going to do it.
Well, the thing is, are they or are they not? I mean, if you had something like they had to change their whole theology to say that the universe doesn't spin around the earth, but in fact that the earth spins around the sun. If they can make that kind of leap, what we're saying is, certainly in this country, just come in line with the laws that are pretty much worldwide, that if a child is being harmed, there's a mandatory reporting clause. Like even for example, in this country, the only privilege that truly exists in law is a client attorney privilege. The I mean, even a psychologist or a doctor who's sworn to heavy levels of confidentiality, if a child discloses abuse, has to tell. Okay, so that's the one thing. The other thing, like in the William Secrediso case, is to say, instead of hiding in the secrecy of the confessional, come out and apologize to your victims, because it's not forgiveness you need to be asking God and the church for. You should actually be asking the victims for forgiveness for what you did.
Okay. Why do you think the church isn't doing this? I mean, why do you think this is not happening? I mean, the church is under huge pressure. It's under huge pressure in the United States, where, in a way, this started, but I don't really mean that it started there, but the sort of media attention. South America, Mexico, why is it not happening?
Look, I think papal infallibility is it's a real theological problem. At what point do you say the Pope got it wrong, say, for example, with the sanctity of the confessional, or at what point do you say that the Pope, God changed his mind? So because the Pope is the direct conduit, how do you suddenly start changing laws because these are meant to be sort of set in stone by divine intervention? And then I think the other thing is, I think that there's, and I say this truly believe in it, there's a large amount of sexual pathology embedded within the church, and they start talking about things. So you go from celibacy to then blaming the homosexual community. One of the priests blamed the homosexual community for bringing sin in, who were then tempted by the devil. So it's almost like there's this divine war being waged for kind of the souls of the earth via the sexual abuse scenario. And there's a thing that's happening in the middle of it that's, for me, really interesting, is that they're kind of saying, okay, we are coming to terms with the fact that child abuse is a crime. We see it more as a sin, and as a sin, it's all about forgiveness and bringing people back to God rather than a judicial intervention.
All right, Luke, in the meantime, the victims of sexual abuse, I mean, there'll be people who we don't know about, who've never told anyone, might have confessed that they were abused, if that doesn't make sense, but might have actually told a priest they'd been abused and no action had been taken. And then they're seeing the Pope not doing what you think should happen. What does that do to the victim? They'll get re-traumatized?
So look, I actually think what has happened is we've taken a step back. Because what's going to happen now is all these bishops, based on what has happened, are going to go back and it's business as usual. And if there was a thought that someone's going to be held accountable and maybe lose their job, there certainly was none of that being said. It's let's go think about and sort of ponder on this. So people coming forward, I think, will be thinking it's going to be much of the same. And that's a massive disincentive to coming forward to disclose.
Luke Lamprecht from Women and Men Against Child Abuse, many thanks for coming in, really do appreciate it.
Pleasure.
So Peace from Mokwetla has your comments tonight.